Happy Sunday, happy Sunday. Welcome back to the podcast Indestructible Soul. And thank you all for joining. And once again, thank you for the continued support and all that good stuff. This is Indestructible Souls, mental wellness for African American men and boys. And, I chose the title Indestructible Souls is because they want our soul, but they can't have it. It's indestructible. And so this weekend, it's a holiday weekend, and we're going to be celebrating Martin Luther King Day, and tomorrow. And I almost didn't do the show in honor of Dr. King, and so I decided to do something a little different. And before I get to the gist of the show, we have a historical moment in terms of we're going to be swearing in our first African American female woman vice president just a couple of days after Martin Luther King's celebration, which is going to be a historical moment. And not only that, unfortunately, we live in a time, due to our soon-to-be former president, we live in a time where things are so divisive socially, racially, that my hope is that they don't turn that event into something that's going to be bittersweet, filled with racism and all those good things, or bad things, I should say. And so I'm excited that it's going to be a new day. And in honor of Dr. King, I wanted to talk about heritage in our history. And so I'm going to have to try to walk through this show. And you might say, what does this have to do with African American men and boys? And I'm going to get to all of that. So the title of today's show is Our History and Our Heritage Must Be Told. And here's the thing. When we talk about in the context, not only just African American men and boys, but us as a people and as a family, we have to make sure that our history, our family history, our heritage, our culture, and all of those things are passed down. Celebrating Dr. King's birthday to a degree has almost become sort of cliche, and he's the sort of the go-to person when somebody wants to talk about, obviously equality and, we celebrate Dr. King and I'm not this, I'm not that. And to a degree, I think his legacy has somewhat been commercialized or minimized, and obviously we don't want that to happen. And so as I was thinking about the holiday coming up, I started to think about the importance of our young boys, our men, our families. Do we know our heritage? Do we know where we come from? And I'm not talking about slavery. The problem is especially with our school system, we are so basically all we ever talk about or what we learn about is slavery. There's a few, figures that they put in the textbooks, and we never talk about not only our own family, but we don't talk about local heroes. We don't talk about, the unsung heroes and things like that. And so I'll tell you a quick story. Growing up, and I've probably shared this story before. Growing up, I never liked to read. I just wasn't a strong reader. I didn't like it, and all of those things. However, knowing that I wanted to go to college and knowing that I had to have good grades to go to college, obviously I got to start reading more. I got to start getting into more competitive classes and all of those things. But I hated history and never did well in history classes and things like that. But one day, my grandmother introduced me to Malcolm X. And she saw me reading this book, and I don't remember what the book was. And she said, you should read Malcolm Speaks. You should read the autobiography of Malcolm X. written by Alex Haley. And for me, that opened up the floodgates. And in actuality, the very first book that I read was the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. That's the very first book I read from cover to cover without it being for a school assignment or something to that degree. And one of the things that my grandmother understood and my mom understood, because my mother was always bringing different books home from work or buying different books, is she understood that for me as a young Black man, the school history lessons did zero for me. I cannot tell you anything about George Washington. I can't tell you anything about the Pilgrims other than Thanksgiving and that they, committed genocide against Native Americans. Can't tell you much more than that. But when it came to Black history, the reality of it is it changed my life. And my grandmother used to always talk about the civil rights movement, but she also always used to talk about our family history. Now, our family history in the sense that who were our ancestors, so to speak, my great grandmother, my great great grandmother, my grandfather, and other relatives, and all of those things. So let me get into the whole textbook part of this first, and then this is going to be an emotional show for me because I want to be able to talk about not only my heritage, but really the heritage of San Bernardino that I think a lot of us have forgotten about because generations have we passed these things along. So let me give some historical context. So when we talk about slavery in the Middle Passage, one of the first things they did was strip us of our identity. They attempted to strip us of our history. They pillaged the families and all of those things. So for us as African Americans, Black people, one of the things is that our story was always told verbally, and it was handed down through storytelling, through poetry, through song, and all of those things. One of the things that I think people don't recognize, and I always said if I built me a big house, I would always have a big porch. The porch is significant to the African American community because that's where stories were told. That's where the elders talked to the younger people and passed down our history. A lot of our history is not in textbooks. And so when we talk about family history and family heritage, what I'm saying is for I'm just going to say boys and African Americans, the reason why that's so important, especially in this day, when you look at social media, when you look at the media, for kids my grandson age, do they know where we come from? They're going to learn about slavery. But right now, all they think is our women are going to be twerkers and our boys are going to be trying to become so feminine that they're competing with, it's to me, they're just twerkers and suckers is what they see. Okay. So one of the things I started thinking about was for this show tonight, and I might have to do it in several parts because there's so much. Here's why we need to pass down our heritage in terms of our history, our family history, our relatives, tell our stories. If you have kids, well, obviously, if you have kids, you're a parent. Does your kids know your story? Do they know your history? Do they know your grandparents' history? Do they know their great grandparents' history? Here's why that's important. There's several reasons why this is so important. That we not only teach them about Martin Luther King, and this is no disrespect to Martin Luther King and any other the prominent figures in Black history. It's no disrespect. But our history starts with our family. And the reason why that's most important is because I feel, or as a kid, I feel connected to it. I can see me in my heritage. I can see me in my family heritage. Now follow me on this. If all we see is what we see in today's world, and all we see in our current family, and if some of those things aren't very positive, what are we supposed to draw from? What are we supposed to draw from? So it is so important that we begin to pass down our family heritage, our family history, our culture, our stories, and share with our kids how we got to this point, even though we're growing, so they know who they are. Now here's a few key points that I want to talk about, and then I'm going to get into some history about San Bernardino. I'm going to get into some history about my family and all those things. And so I'm just going to be honest real quick. I'm going to look at some of my notes. Now here's the thing. One of the reasons why passing down heritage and history is so important is because it shows me and it gives me my identity, especially as a young Black man, as a young Black girl. And if my circumstances as it sits right now isn't that positive, and I look around and I see that everybody around me is doing X, Y, or Z, sometimes I'm not able to draw from that to help me figure out my identity. And here's just some quick history real quick. So my grandmother used to, and I'll tell you a quick story. My grandmother used to always talk about how she drove from Detroit, Michigan to California with a U-Haul trailer and slept the first night. She slept in her car with her 3 kids in downtown San Bernardino. Now, for those of you who know San Bernardino, obviously this was in the 60s. But part of that was her first night they slept in the park or slept in the car. And then she grew from that because she was leaving Detroit to start a new life for her and her kids. She grew from that to be a very prominent figure in the city of San Bernardino. Why is that important to me, even though that was her journey? Because in her story, I'm able to connect to her story of triumph, which then lets me know in my heritage, which lets me know in my family that I can see how hardship can turn to triumph. And if we don't share these stories, how are our kids supposed to get these things? It gives hope. Here's the thing. Here's something else. When I work with kids, especially kids who are really depressed and they're having trouble with their families, they have trouble dreaming. They have trouble creating things. But when we begin to share our stories and share our history and share things about our families and our family history, it rejuvenates their dreams. If Uncle did this, I can do this. And here's the thing. I don't believe in coincidences in the sense that I think certain things are passed through. Not only was my grandmother a businesswoman, but prior to that, she was a beautician. She had her own shop. But now look, my daughter is doing the same thing. There's an entrepreneurial spirit in the family. There's a spirit of creativity. Not only was my grandmother a civil rights activist, my mother, even though she worked for the U.S. government, she was the EOP officer where she fought for people's rights within the U.S. government. If somebody felt discriminated against, they went to her. Now here's some other just quick family history, and I'm going to get into some more detail. But when we talk about heritage, I'm able to see me, and I'm able to draw from that because I understand that not only my family history, but this is history in the city of San Bernardino. This is world history. This is U.S. history. And one of the things that my grandmother was very proud about, and here's the thing. Today we talk about Colin Kaepernick, kneeling, and then somehow the American flag became synonymous with veterans. to my understanding, the U.S. flag belongs to all of us. But one of the things that my grandmother used to make sure that we knew was that my great-grandfather was a lieutenant in the Army. But you got to think about that time. But during that time, they refused to salute him because he was Black. And from that, my great-grandmother, after my great-grandfather passed, was able to take his pension and become a businesswoman. In Detroit, Michigan, she owned a 20-bed rooming house in Detroit, Michigan, where she raised her family. And then from that, being raised in the church, big part of our heritage. Coming to California, setting roots here in San Bernardino, California, to not only living here, but affecting this city and this community in a positive way. So when we talk about heritage, and I'm going to get to some more facts about not only my family and why this is important, in honor of Dr. King, is in this city, in this very city of San Bernardino, we have some very rich history. On the west side of San Bernardino, the sad part about it, here's the sad part about it. When you look at my generation and older, they remember that history. But if you drive around the city of San Bernardino and you drive around, especially the west side, that heritage and that spirit and that history is lost. It's lost. So when you think about the way the city looks now, but particularly the west side of San Bernardino, some of that history and that pride, if kids knew the heritage, if they knew the different monuments on the west side of San Bernardino, if they knew the things that took place on those streets, maybe we would respect it more. Something to think about. And so one of the things that I really wanted to talk about today is, and this is a challenge to you parents and to you families, are you talking about, one, your history, good, bad, or indifferent, so your kids can learn from it? Do you still sit around and talk about family history? Do you talk about grandma and grandpa? Do you talk about great-grandma and so forth? Do you still bring out the family photos and show them who they are? Mind you, I didn't say show them pictures of relatives, show them who they are. And here's what I mean by that. When I show my grandson a picture of great-grandma or grandpa or pappy, I'm showing him who he is because that's in his blood. Think about that. If great-grandpa was a lieutenant in the military, my grandson he's fascinated with astronauts. So if he knew his great-great-grandfather was a lieutenant in the military in a time where it wasn't popular because it was Black, do you think that would motivate him to strive harder to be an astronaut one day? Great-great-grandpa did it. If Janaea, my daughter, knew that my grandmother, before she became a city councilwoman and all this other stuff, owned her own beautician out of her house, and now my daughter is striving to be a makeup artist, and here's how she did it, do you think that would motivate her? Think about that. Are you sharing your family history? Because frankly, I think that we minimize who we are as a people because, for one, we don't even share our local history, let alone our family history. One of the things that I remember is whether we were driving in the car, Sunday dinners, sitting out on the front porch at my grandmother's house, she had this patio, or just, in church, she would always tell these stories about our family. Now, my family, by the way, so when you look at my grandfather, his family comes from Holly Springs, Mississippi, up to Detroit. My grandmother's side comes through Iowa, through Detroit to California. So when we look at that, oftentimes, a lot of us, can we even trace our lineage? Can we trace our history? Can we trace our families? Why is that important? So when you talk about kids don't know who they are, a lot of times we don't teach them. I'll share this quick story, and then I'm going to share some really valuable San Bernardino Black history, since we are coming up on Black History Month. Just real quick. So I'm not going to say the name of the company that I was working for, and one of the things I worked for this big company, 20 years, blah blah blah. I talked about that before. And so I started working at this other place over there on 9th Street in San Bernardino at the Boys Club. And, I stay pretty quiet. I don't say too much. And here and there, I would mention who my grandmother was. Here and there, I would mention who my cousin, or, we called her my aunt, even though she was technically our cousin, but she was the same age as my grandmother. And I remember I was at the Boys Club one day, and one of the directors of the Boys Club stopped me. And he was like, "So-and-so is your grandmother?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "So-and-so is your cousin?" I said, "Yeah." So he was like, "Valerie's your grandmother?" "Yeah." "Francis is your cousin?" Instantly, the demeanor and the respect for me changed because of the work that they did. And what I mean by the respect for it was because of the work that they did in the community, not me. And the impact that they had on the community, it gave me membership. It instantly made me family because of the work that they did in the community. And I'm going to get into some of that because our history, sometimes we read these textbooks and we have these kids read these textbooks, but they can't touch these people, dead or alive. It's too far away. But if you had somebody in your family that made a difference, that invented something, that did different things, no matter how big or small, think about how impactful that would be on a young boy. Think about that. Because in reality, like I said before, you're showing them who they are. And like I said, I might have to do this show in 2 parts. I think I want to get my mother and my sister in here to talk about some of this history. But I want to show you a couple of things. And this is, and believe it or not, this is in honor of Dr. King, and you'll see why this matters so much. And for those of you who live in the city of San Bernardino, especially the west side of San Bernardino, and I know a lot of us have pride, even though, San Bernardino is what it is, we have pride in the west side. I don't care where I go, I let people know I'm from the west side of San Bernardino. But I don't have to look far to honor somebody for Black history. I don't have to look far. I can look right at my family. And I'm so proud of that. And I'm going to struggle to not get emotional talking about this. But here's where I'll start. I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen, but I want to talk about this and show you how impactful some of the women, the Black women in our community were. And our kids need to know They need to know this heritage. They have to know. I think it's super important. So I hope you can see this. I hope you can see this. So what this is a cover of Ebony Magazine 1980. I think that's what it says. I hope that's not the price. You can see how old it was, how old it is, because the price is only $1.50 and you got Lena Horne on the cover. Why am I showing you this? Why am I showing you this? Because when we talk about green energy, so follow me on this, and I want to show you this. When we talk about green energy and everybody's talking about solar panels and people come to your house trying to sell you solar panels and all these other things. My grandmother in the 70s introduced solar heating into California for low-income housing in the 70s, and she made it into Ebony Magazine. And believe it or not, one of the things I vaguely remember as a kid, when we talk about Delman Heights, the community, Delman Heights, you got Delman Heights Center, but right there off of Mallory used to be a solar site that produced solar energy. And so my grandmother, in her foresight, brought solar energy to low-income housing to obviously reduce bills and all those things, and she received national recognition for her efforts. And this is one of her, and if you look at that top picture, I believe that's in Delman Heights, which in that solar site is gone now. But when you look at the work that she's done and everything that you see now when it comes to solar energy, I'm pretty sure most of you did not know that this African-American woman from the city of Detroit had the foresight with her organization to bring this type of energy. Not only did it produce energy, it produced jobs into the west side of San Bernardino. I'll show you this other picture. I got to go back to this other picture real quick. Y'all see my sister? That was before perms and Jerry curls. She gonna get me for that one. And so here's why this is important to understand, and is a part of our history, is that when we look at things now, sometimes we struggle. Sometimes we struggle and we have to look far for greatness when it's right in our families. Do you sit down and tell your kids your story? Do you sit down and talk about your heritage? Now, I'm going to put another picture up. And this is, and I'm talking about my grandmother, Valerie Pope Lutnam, and I want to get into some of the details, but there's just a lot. So this picture right here is when my grandmother was in the city council for 8 years, and she was the first African-American woman to be on the city council in the city of San Bernardino. The first African-American woman. And she served 2 terms. And when you look at how she got there, remember, when she first came to California, her first night was sleeping in her car at the park, coming from Detroit with a U-Haul and 3 children. That's a heritage that kids need to know. Now, let me show you this. So when we talk about being a civil rights leader, follow me on this. And I'm going to show you some other pictures. Martin Luther King wasn't the only one. And I know you know that. I know you know that. But follow me on this. We have many local leaders in our family that were on the picket line, that were on the front line. Do your kids know? Do your kids know that your grandparents marched? That they were there? that they fought for equal justice. Now check this out. There are so many details. One of the things that my grandmother is most known for, not only developing San Bernardino Westside Community Development Corporation, but she fought to integrate schools. And I'm going to read something to you real quick. I want you to hear this. And I don't know if you guys know this. And I'm going to talk about my cousin in a minute, which is Frances Grice. Do you know that in 1978, because of the work that they done, that the Supreme Court, follow me this, because you only hear about what is it, Brown Board of Education, that's the Supreme Court ruled that San Bernardino School District was guilty of segregation and discrimination. But it was due to the efforts of Bonnie Johnson, my grandmother, Frances Grice, and there's many others, Margaret Hill, that fought. Like we have all these local heroes. When we come up on Martin Luther King Day, we have all these local heroes, and do we celebrate them? More importantly, do we pass down this history from generation to generation? Because our kids need to know how great they are. One of the things, not only when it comes to civil rights, if you're from the city of San Bernardino, one of the things that my grandmother did was to produce jobs in low-income housing. So some of you ride around Baseline and there's a building right next to Arroyo Valley High School. Used to be called the T. Hughes Building. Also, you see all of those factories up there on Hallmark in the city of San Bernardino. There's at least one factory that my grandmother and her corporation put up there. The T. Hughes Building now, I believe it belongs to a church, was an office that even the county used to rent out, but it was a place where there was job training, summer job training, different apprentice programs that put people to work, that produce jobs. Now, I want to show you something else. Now, my cousin, Aunt Frances, was a definite force to be reckoned with. Now, here's the thing. And if anybody out there from the west side of San Bernardino and they're in politics, it would be a travesty if not one day, that there's not a school named after Frances Grice. There should be a school named after her in the city of San Bernardino at some point. Let me go ahead and put up this picture. Now follow me on this. San Bernardino, believe it or not, is one of the few cities that has a statue of Martin Luther King. And if you look to the far left, the bottom left-hand corner, that's my cousin Frances Grice. And this is at one of the celebrations, but not only was the west side of San Bernardino and people like Frances, people like Bonnie Johnson, people like Margaret Hill and all these other names were instrumental in getting that statue in front of City Hall in the city of San Bernardino. If you understand the history of San Bernardino, that's not a small feat. And this is a celebration because Frances fought to make sure that that statue was renovated and making sure that it could stand the test of time. I'll say it that way. Now, I remember as a kid, every Martin Luther King Day, birthday, we used to have to go to the prayer breakfast. And I know they have prayer breakfasts all over the country now. But then after that, all the little kids used to go march around singing "We Shall Overcome" when we marched around the statue. But guess what used to happen prior to the celebration? Almost every year somebody would vandalize it and painted and all this other stuff with racist stuff. But let me tell you who Francis is. And like I said before, this is heritage in my family. And I'm asking, are you sharing your heritage with your family, especially during this time? And this isn't just in my family. This is the city and county of San Bernardino, as well as the state. So here's, if you're from San Bernardino, from my side is the far left is Bonnie Johnson. In the middle is my cousin Francis Grice, and right is my grandmother. Now, one of the things that my cousin Francis is most known for is what opening, I don't know if you want to call it a school, or it was a job training program called Operation Second Chance, where it was a job training program for young adults on the west side of San Bernardino, where they would receive training in administrative jobs that most Black people couldn't get. And one of the things that was different about her, she was big on education, but administrative skills, clerical skills, and things like that. And she was able to place people in jobs in universities, corporate offices. She had a contract with the utility services, and she was also a part of the movement with the freedom schools and things like that. And so one of the things that I'm so proud about when it comes to my cousin and Aunt Frances is that not only was she a force to be reckoned with, when she showed up, she made things happen. And it wasn't always pretty. And I want to read a couple of things to you. And I'm going to put the picture back up of Bonnie Johnson and my grandmother and Frances, because they were a trio. One of the things that they developed is what they called League of Mothers. And they were part of what was the welfare rights movement. And when we talk about freedom schools, because you hear about them in the South, we had them here in San Bernardino. When you talk about equal rights, equal pay, and things like that, these three women were at the front of the line. They organized boycotts. They created freedom schools, lunch programs, all of those things that you hear about elsewhere. And like I said, I don't want to minimize their accomplishments. And this probably should be a two-parter, because I don't want to read through some of these things, because I want to be able to tell you exactly all of the things that they did. But one of the biggest things, if you think about that, they took the school board of San Bernardino to the Supreme Court and won. They created jobs. They fought for equality. They did all of those things that we give Martin Luther King credit for, and he should get credit, but this happened in our own community, in our own families. Think about that. Now follow me on this. And I want you to understand this. Here's why heritage, here's why history is extremely important to our kids. Extremely important, especially in this day and age where our kids are looking in so many places to find inspiration, to find motivation, to find out or figure out who they are. When was the last time, and I have to say I'm guilty of this too, that we've sat down with our kids and gave them their history? Let them know who they are. Let them know where they come from. Now, I could tell you a big piece of my family history. One of the, my grandfather on my mother's side, he was a hustler, right? I met him when we were kids, and the thing is, he was a hustler. He worked for Ford Motor Company at one point, but that wasn't for him. He was, and but on the flip side of that, you have my grandmother, who was an activist, who was a businesswoman, who was a civil rights leader, who was a politician, a councilwoman, and let's not forget who was a minister, who was a preacher. And if you know, in the 50s, 60s, whatever, back in that day, Ford Motor Company and all the car industry was big in Detroit. And so that's where most people worked at. But when factories begin to close and people begin to spread out, my grandmother moves to California and lay roots and built this giant legacy. My great grandfather was a lieutenant in the military. That's something my grandson needs to know. I remember we used to have these family dinners where I remember the family dinner. I think it was at my cousin Marlene's house, where she, they cooked some chicken and dumplings and all that good stuff. And we sat around and played bid whist. Now, mind you, I was a youngster, and me and my cousin Reese, we ran the table. My grandmother taught us how to play bid whist, and we ran the table of all these old folks. But they broke out this picture, and I'll never forget this picture, and I hope one day to get my hands on it and just to be able to make a copy of it. I'll never forget this picture. Because we always talk about, certain people always talk about slavery and how we need to forget about it. And I remember I said before, we're only 7 generations out of slavery. But this picture, it's better than my brain. It was what would be my great-great-grandmother. And all I remember is very dark skin, and one of those long gown slavery dresses that you see in the movies, that you see on TV. And it was just her. And remember, she was standing there proud, whatever. I can't really make out the face. But as a kid, not sure how old I was between 10 and 11, not sure. But as a kid, that was tangible evidence of my heritage and my history. A picture of my great-great-grandmother who was a slave. I want to say Marlene or Frances, and then one of them may have it. Think about that. Because it's one thing to talk about where you come from. It's one thing to know it. It's one thing to know and see your family history to motivate you, that you know that we are not drug pushers. We are not dope fiends. We are not criminals. We are not these threatening people that this media want us to believe that we are. We are not those things. And we are powerful. We made this country better. And one of the reasons why we're so threatening is because the masses know, if you give Black people the fair chance that we deserve, the equal chance that we would deserve, we'll move this world. We've already done it. We have impacted every industry on the face of this earth when given the chance. Do our kids know that? Believe this or not, and this isn't This isn't a racist thing. You might take it as such. We will change the world. We have changed the world. If there's going to be anything impactful, it's going to come from a person of color. It's just the way it is. But here's what I want you to understand. And this is, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to get some people in here to talk about the history and the heritage of San Bernardino, especially the west side of San Bernardino. When I drive in that side of town, I don't even recognize it anymore. Do me a favor. Instead of during February, Black History Month and all that stuff and putting up all those cliches and all that stuff and whatever, talk about your family history. Teach your family history. If you don't know, ask somebody. Call the elders. Put that history down on paper. Do our kids know? Do our grandkids know what and where they come from? Understand this. When my grandmother told the story about coming from Detroit to California, when she talks about having to stand toe to toe with the Ku Klux Klan and fight things in court and all those things, and when my mother talks about those things, she's telling me about me. What she's saying is, Johnny, you got that fight. What she's saying is, you can't lay down. What she's saying is, you fight for what's right. When she talks about my grandfather and being in the military, my great grandmother being a businesswoman, and the things that I've seen her do, when I've seen my mother raise 4 kids with college degrees, coming off of welfare, they're telling my story. I've been in some big fights in my day. I've been in some terrible, terrible fights in my day. But it was my heritage. It was the lineage. It was the bloodline that helped me fight. Think about that. Are we instilling our boys with that pride? Are we instilling our girls with that pride? Or are we turning them to a bunch of chumps and twerkers and this and all that other stuff? When I walked into those rooms and they realized who my grandmother was, when they realized who my cousin was, the respect, the honor, I got to stand on their names. Think about that. We as African Americans, Black people, our history is too rich. Our struggle is too powerful to be lost. Think about that. For us in San Bernardino, we don't have to go far. We don't have to go to the textbook to talk about our history. Begin to instill into our boys and our girls their rich history, starting with your family. So as we celebrate tomorrow, in honor of Dr. King and his struggle. And we all know he was assassinated. And my grandson wants to go to the Lorraine Motel to visit. He's already been taught about that. He'll go. We'll take him. If you haven't started instilling information into our kids, other than a bunch of stuff, let's start this week. We don't have to go far when we talk about Black history. It's right in our front yard. This has been Indestructible Soul. Thank you for tuning in. Please go to YouTube. You can look up Indestructible Souls and subscribe to the channel. You can find me on Twitter, and I'm newly on Clubhouse, still learning that platform, building the following and all that good stuff. And you can also check me out at Beauregard Therapy, on Psychology Today and all those things. And once again, this has been Indestructible Soul, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Happy Martin Luther King Day. And I don't care what happens with the Trumpians and all that stuff. Don't let them shit on our day. Have a good night.